had quite a problematic opposition. We've had an opposition that has ignored half of our case, which is principles. They've only focused on mechanistic analysis that will show you still stands in today's debate, right? But secondly, we've had an opposition that says they respect sovereignty, but they want to manipulate countries into doing certain things. We have an opposition that says we should allow for organic change, but the only people that know about these diplomatic meetings are executives. These people don't spread the word to society. Therefore, people that should be having their mentalities changed are not changed because they don't have access to this manipulation that opposition wants to impose to these particular countries. So I'll analyze this debate using two simple questions, right? So I'll firstly show you why our model does create some change, and even if it didn't, we still uphold our principles. Therefore, I'll show you effectiveness and why this mechanism is better than the proposed model they brought up. And then I'll secondly look at what's best for South Africa, and do we have a mandate to prioritize, one, our values or Africa's needs, right? So let's go to this first idea. The first idea, the first issue in today's debate was this idea of change. And what we had here was, is our policy going to create influence? Are we going to influence these people? There was quite a lot of contradictions, because they said, listen, South Africa is too small to have influence. But in their whole second speech, they were like, South Africa is big and they need resources to influence the economies of these countries. So it's necessary that we don't cut ties. But let's rebut it anyway. So on the first level, we've shown you that we do have economic influence, because one, these countries have lost a lot of investment from Western countries and European countries. Example, Zimbabwe, they've had sanctions on the economy. And they depended largely on us for investment and us for development aid, or not necessarily development aid, just resources in general. The second speaker did say we contribute largely in terms of resources, training and whatnot. And we say when we remove this, we create and we give a wake-up call to these governments to either change or enshrine rights to protect homosexuals. And we think that's the change we need. But we'll show you in our second pillar, or in our second level, why a formal change does change things, right? But do we have an influence in terms of negotiations? This is where they brought up their model. They were like, let's just sit down, talk, and hope things will change. But the reason why we're cutting ties is because it's the last resort. We think for too long have we've spoken to African countries and told them, change your ways or do this. For too long have we imposed and told them about principles and the international law. And for too long have they not listened. They needed to give us mechanistic analysis as to why they suddenly listen. We show you that we remove an economic need that they need to make sure that the standard of living in their countries are sorted out. When you don't have an economy that is stimulating or working, you lose out on money, which means you lose out on a lot of development. When we remove that factor, we think we force you to change. We give you no option but to change, right? So in terms of negotiations, we think they've failed, and we think we need to do something more practical. And if we remove economic ties and diplomatic ties, we think we do create a change. Now taken so, right? And then secondly, the only thing they told us was, but that's not the real problem. The problem is that people have different mentalities and they're not going to change the way they think suddenly. So firstly, we'd say culture is not stagnant. So people do change. For example, in South Africa, people thought that circumcision should only be done in terms of tradition, but now they allow Western doctors to help them in the process. So culture does change if you give people the reason for change. We think we do change their mentality. None taken. But we think in human nature, even if we don't change your mentality, we think people will prioritize having food rather than dying. So what does this mean? If you don't have an economic system that is working and we make it worse, if we remove food, we force you to prioritize your needs. And your needs is not religion, it's food, because without food, you won't be alive to follow your religion, right? So we don't give them an option. We allow for change. So we change the mentalities of these people. But let's go to this third level of formal change. They say, even if you do enshrine it in your constitution, it doesn't change anything. No one gets helped because people are still raped in these societies in terms of correctal rape and whatnot. But what we tell you in today's debate is, one, we allow for accountability. We think when you enshrine something in your constitution, people can hold you accountable. We think we allow for activist groups to grow up because they know they have legislature backing them up. We think in status quo, talking and hoping that things change, you don't do anything. You allow for people to die. You allow for people to go hungry, irregardless. So in terms of comparison on who's winning this debate already, it's proposition because we create a change, and they hope that things change without doing anything. None taken. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, what does accountability mean? It means people in the executive body within those governments can then suppress to the rule of law. It means even if the president doesn't enshrine certain things, you can hold him accountable in terms of the rule of law. We think that's what the legislature does. It protects people on higher levels as well. But what do we do even more? We think we allow people the choice to have gender sexuality, gender freedom, right? We allow people to choose what they want. In status quo, they can't do that because they know they're going to be either one, ostracized or harmed by society. I'll take you in a minute now. Or harmed by society. We think when we give you legal support, you have the right and you have the courage to sort of go out and choose what you want. In status quo, that doesn't happen.
So with African leaders like Gaddafi, like Mugabe, who are uncompromising and will allow people to die for starvation, you think that's okay to let people die to starve?
Thank you, ma'am. We think people are dying in your world as well because people are being shunned to death and they're being raped irregardless. So you're an opposition that concedes that there's a problem, but you do nothing about it. Proposition does change something. Show us why our mechanistic analysis doesn't work in today's debate, right? We allow people more choice in terms of sexuality. We think in status quo, they're fearful of going out because there's no law and they can't hold government accountable. We allow people to go out knowing that they have a legislative system that backs them up. In status quo, that doesn't happen. But lastly, we incentivize groups like the LGBT groups to come out. Why? Because they have law backing them up. We allow people to support each other. We allow people that have always been fearful of liking gay people to actually do it without fear. Because if they're shunned for it, they can go to court and hold people accountable. I'll take no POIs from now on, right? Let's get to this last thing, ladies and gentlemen, right? What does law do in conclusion? We think, one, we allow for recourse, right? Just recourse, right? And lastly, we allow for people to hold their government accountable. And we think that formal change does change status quo, whereas you do nothing. Let's get to this last idea of does South Africa have to prioritize their principles or save Africa instead? So firstly, we needed some analysis that it's South Africa's mandate to save Africa from opposition. We got nothing of that sort. They told us we should care, they didn't tell us why we shouldn't care. But then they said South Africa should do what's best for them. What is best for South Africa? We think what's best for South Africa is to uphold the will of its own people. And the will of its own people is making sure that human rights all across the world are upheld. Why do we say this? We say people in South Africa that even hated gay people are starting to accept it. We think people in South Africa want people in South Africa want human rights to be held. We think that's the will of the South African government, and that's the will of their people, and that's what they should be upholding. We need them to tell us why that shouldn't be that way. But last, let's go into this idea of the principles that we should be upholding. We told you principles should be consistent. Principles should always never have double standards. They had no response to that. They didn't touch that. All they did was deal with the practicals, which we've already tackled. But lastly, African development. We still don't know why we should care. We still don't know why we should have a mandate. It's time South Africa stood up for their morals and stopped being touristic. Thank you.